Well, welcome, fellow students of the Faculty of Economics and Business. Welcome, welcome. Today, we are going to present you something about the theoretical perspectives on international strategic alliances. The three guys who are sitting in front of you are Jesse and Rick. Me, myself, is Peter, and we're going to try to tell you today something about how transaction cost theory, how does transaction cost theory explain the choice for governance modes? And we're going to elaborate further on it by using the two articles. The first one is of Gulati, which is being published in 1995. The other article which we're going to use is the one of Oxley, published in 1999. Well, first kick off with the basics of the transaction cost economics. Well, what is shortly the transaction cost economics? Well, it's quite straightforward. They are the transaction costs which arise out of concerns about opportunistic behavior. It It's been divided in four parts. The first one is cost of creating contracts. The second one is the monitoring contractual performance. Third one is enforcing contractual promises, and finally, the fourth one is addressing breaches of contractual promises. Well, what are governance modes in alliances? Well, the two articles that we are going to explain further, they divided alliances in equity and non-equity. The equity alliances are, for example, the joint venture, which involves the creation of a new and also a independent jointly owned entity. A other example is that one of the partners takes a minority equity position in the other partner or partners. The other one is the non-equity, as you can see. And non-equity is, for example, licensing, second sourcing, or which Oxley in his paper mentions. They call them contractual arrangements. So, yeah, that's shortly about the alliances and equity and non-equity.
So we continue with the implications of repeated ties of the article of Gelati in 1995. The first hypothesis is that alliances are more likely to be equity-based if they have a shared R&D component, and this hypothesis is supported. And this comes due to the fact that alliances with an R&D component are likely to have higher transaction costs than those that don't have a joint R&D. And R&D alliances are therefore more likely to be equity based. And then the second hypothesis that they conducted is that the greater the number of previous alliances between the partners in an alliance, the less likely the alliance is to be equity based. So this comes because that trust reduces the fear for opportunistic behavior. So the transaction costs are limited if they already have a great number of previous alliances. And the authors did split up this hypothesis into smaller hypotheses because there is a difference between previous equity-based alliances and previous non-equity alliances. And this might affect the type of new alliance because firms might prefer non-equity only if they already have had equity alliances, which ensures that they already have built up the trust among each other. And so the number of previous equity alliances lead to a reduction in the chance that the new alliance will be equity based. And they also expected that the number of previous non-equity alliances between partners, there would also be less likely that it would also be less likely that the new alliance would be equity based. But this is not supported, and that is probably because they haven't built up the trust yet, and loose contracts, etc., don't lead to very good interaction in the past. Then they have also looked at firms among different nations, and they expected that alliances would be more likely to be equity-based if firms come from different nations. So there is a positive relation there, and this was confirmed, and that's basically because they don't trust each other because of cultural distance. So they're afraid of opportunistical behavior from the other party. And then the last hypothesis that they conducted is that they expected that firms in alliances with more than two firms would be dysfunctional, and therefore there would be a greater chance that they would create an equity-based alliance, but they could not find significant results for this hypothesis. So what does the article of Giulati tell us? First, the goal is to explain factors, to find factors that explain the governance structure in individual-based alliances. The first finding is that firms use equity alliances when the transaction costs with an exchange are too high to justify a quasi-market non-equity alliance. So, in other words, if purchasing is too expensive, you create an equity alliance, for example, a joint venture. Second finding is that repeated alliances between two partners are less likely than other alliances to be using equity, because there is already trust among these partners, so they don't need equity anymore. And then alliances cannot be analyzed as single events, and that prior ties should be taken into account. So the previous literature always saw an alliance as a single event, so they didn't look at the prior ties, which can lead to more trust among companies, but they've always ignored it, and this should be taken into account.
We will continue with the paper by Oxley about the impact of intellectual property protection. Oxley researches the alliances between US and non-US firms. A lot of these firms are afraid for appropriability hazard. This is the risk that your partner appropriates your intellectual properties without permissions. He stated three hypotheses. One of the first hypothesis is intellectual property protection. So if there is a high intellectual property protection in the country of your ally, firms are less likely to control a high degree of hierarchical. In other words, they are more comfortable with working with these firms. So they're less stimulated and less likely to control these allies. The second hypothesis is the difficulty of specifying property rights. So in other words, if there are difficult property rights, so asset creation or substantial modification, or even if know-how is very tacit, firms are more likely to have a high degree of hierarchical control, because it is very tacit and hard knowledge to control from a great distance. The last hypothesis is about the difficulty of monitoring. How greater the difficulty of monitoring is, how more firms are likely to have a high degree of hierarchical control because of technical or geographic scope that is really large. Now I will continue to the conclusion and also the answer for the central question. The central question was, how does transaction cost theory explain the choice for governance mode and then equity or non-equity alliances? So our answer is that higher transaction costs lead to equity investment. So like we already explained, if you have to monitor all the time or control, this brings a lot of transactions cost, and therefore firms are more likely to do equity investments so they can work more closely with their allies, and Their allies have the same incentives, the same goal. Sometimes they share resources, so they are less forced to monitor and have create high transaction cost. Lower transaction cost, on the other hand, leads to non-equity investments. For example, because of the high trust that is between two firms, they are less forced to control each other and to monitor all the time. So their transaction costs will be lower, and therefore they're not really forced or willing to do equity investments. So in this case, there will only be a contractual arrangement, for example. This was our presentation. Thanks for watching, and have a nice lecture.